I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Karen Keaveney. Karen is the head of rural development and an assistant professor in the University College Dublin's School of Agriculture and Food Sciences. She's a geographer and a qualified regional and urban planner. Karen has research interests in rural planning and housing, rural development, and agricultural education. She has expertise in local decision-making and governance, rural power relations, and socioeconomic change in the countryside. Her publications and research include the areas of policy response to rural change, cross-border and interjurisdictional planning, local government reform, and planning on the island of Ireland. She has just commenced a project called In Place with a consortium investigating the impacts of COVID-19 on commuting towns on the island of Ireland.
Thank you so much. Good day to everybody. I think I was going to say good afternoon. We're coming towards the end of our working day here in Ireland. We're just gone 4 o'clock, but I know it's a different time for many people. So it's wonderful to be joined from all over the world today, and really interesting to be talking about the various impacts of COVID on rural places. And I think I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody else, but I think there will be a lot of commonalities and also differences depending on the geography that we're in. So today I'm going to talk about the various levels of responses and experiences that have taken place with COVID. I suppose the core of what I'm speaking about is really scale. I am a geographer, so I'm really interested in scale and how people interact with places. But I'm going to talk kind of about the very low, the lowest sort of scale, the personal geographies. I'm going to talk about local responses to national and implications for future policy. So I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes. Ryan, do tell me to be quiet if you need to. And I think today really I'm going to be, it's going to be a fairly general approach. There's obviously lots of detail, but I think it's really today is about getting the conversation started, because while this is also a public webinar, it's also the start of a summer school for some of our postgraduate students as well. So first of all, just thinking about personal geographies. And the reason I decided to start with this was because as I was preparing last week for my presentation, I started to just pick some photographs out that I wanted to use. And what I actually started to see was kind of the journey that we had starting out. And so early March of 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago now for many, it's so strange to think that in early March we were doing the normal things. And some of you may recognize a character here in this photograph, Professor David Douglas, Professor Emeritus from the University of Guelph. And David was on campus in Dublin, in University College Dublin with us, giving a wonderful presentation to our students. And COVID was there, we were aware, but obviously had no sense of the implications. And even the following week, I brought some of our master's students on a field trip. And again, we were kind of talking about it and thinking about what was going to change, but it was quite a shock that those photographs that are there on the left-hand side of the screen were taken on the 11th of March. And then on the 12th of March in Ireland specifically, our then Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, announced from Washington, because he was over there for his annual St. Patrick's Day visit, that schools, universities, colleges were going to close. And that was really when the shock came, as much as we knew something was going to happen. And I think I did what a lot of people did on that day. I went to the supermarket. Of course, these were one of the sites to greet me with empty shelves. So it's sometimes I wanted to kind of highlight that, because sometimes we kind of forget that it was a shock what happened, and we've kind of adapted and we have been resilient, but actually it was a sudden break in everything that we knew to be normal. And really the questions now is what will happen when we go back to whatever the new normal will be. I know for me, after that day on the 12th, this became my life. I did a lot of baking, tried to connect with family, made a lot of sourdough starter, did our St. Patrick's Day decorations at the table, and I had a lot of work interrupted by my lovely kids. So that's a lot of memories. And as I was going through them, I saw all those photographs I had taken. So that's really, we all had our own personal journeys in all of this. So taking it out to the broader level, more globally, I want to just reflect a little bit on rural and COVID itself. And I think we use a lot of the language around opportunities, challenges, vulnerabilities, and change when we think about what has happened over the last 12 to 15 months. So really the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the vulnerabilities of rural areas, which have been particularly exposed because they have, among other things, a much less diversified economy than urban places, a higher share of workers in essential jobs, such as agriculture, food processing, coupled with a limited capability to undertake these jobs from home, so making teleworking a challenge, poorer access to services, and a large digital divide with lower accessibility to the internet, both in coverage and connection speed. And that's coming from the OECD report, which is in our shared resources for this webinar. For Ireland, a central vulnerability in the rural population is the higher proportion of older people living in rural places, coupled with the lack of access to services and proximity to specialised care. So I mentioned scale at the beginning, and I do want to talk about this a little bit more. So, and my focus is on Ireland, of course. So just so we know, I'll be using quite a few maps in this presentation. This is Ireland here. We're a small island on the northwest of Europe, very connected to Europe, to the United Kingdom in particular, given our international border with the UK, and obviously very connected to North America in particular as well. Our island has an international border, as I said, and obviously Dublin there is our capital. And so economically, a lot of our economic development and our highest diversity of employment, particularly technical jobs, are based in Dublin. From a rural point of view then, I just thought it might be useful to show this map because it just highlights the different types of rurals that we're dealing with in Ireland. The red areas are those peri-urban areas close to urban areas. And then as we kind of go from green to blue, we've got very strong rural agricultural areas to weaker, more marginal areas. For those not familiar with Ireland, we tend to have kind of an east-west divide geographically on the island, where the weaker areas, the less structurally strong, more economically vulnerable areas tend to be in the west and northwest of the island. That will be considered very rural, tending to be more isolated, distant, furthest distance from large urban centres. So that's just to give a little bit of background to some of the issues that I'll be talking about. And I am going to just show a few maps here, just to highlight some of the vulnerabilities we're dealing with when COVID hit us last March. Like many rural areas, Ireland is experiencing depopulation, but growth as well. We're still a very rural country in the sense that about 35%, about 40 to 38% of the population is rural. So we're still, it's about a 60-40 split, 60% in urban areas, 40%-ish in rural areas. And the blues in this map show population decline over a 25-year period. So that ties in with what I was saying in the previous map, where we tend to be weaker in the west, stronger in the east of the country. The pinks and reds where this population increases. And I just want to go through a couple of maps very quickly here. This is showing the actual population in 2016 when our last census was done. And again, the darker the areas, the higher the population. And you can see just to so many global patterns, the rural population is higher, close to urban centres, lower, further away. And I've got a couple of maps just showing some areas of employment. So for example, we still have a very high dependence on agriculture and forestry in rural areas. also a higher dependency on building and construction, and also from a public sector point of view, we would have in rural areas high employment in the public sector as well. That's just showing a little bit of background to the rural setting that we're talking about. So when it comes to COVID, we had some interesting kind of approaches, and what I'm going to do today is look at local responses and national responses and see how they kind of interplayed with each other. So really, for the local responses to need and to the restrictions that took place, which I'll talk about momentarily, civic society really was responsive. It reacted quickly. It was in a position to really quickly pivot to the respond to need. So there was a particular focus on older people and those living in isolation. And through established networks of the community and voluntary sectors, people were able to really act quickly. They acted through networks. So for example, and this is just one example of many, young people began to volunteer through organisations such as the GAA, which is our Gaelic Football and Hurling Association, which is a national sport of Ireland and really is located in every town and village in Ireland. And so because it was on the ground, it could actually act to identify who was vulnerable and how to help them. We got a little bit of international coverage, and you see some of my presentations focused today on an area called Roscommon, which is in the middle of Ireland. NPR in the US even covered some of the work that was being done, and it looked at how a community radio was set up, or a community radio show was set up to actually connect with people. And something as simple as radios were delivered to vulnerable people so that they could listen to the radio and be less isolated. So that's just examples of some of how civic society reacted. On the other hand, private sector had to change its business models. It adopted to digital sales and communications. And there was a lot of government supports, which are still in place. Government supports to help those who had a downturn in business and also those people who had to be temporarily unemployed, all of which are still in place at the moment. The local responses did highlight certain issues and vulnerabilities in rural Ireland, which really, I think, hadn't been talked about in a very big way. While it was easier and is easier to identify that rural areas are characterised by higher numbers of older people, there are issues also with other vulnerable people, such as migrants, particularly those working in food processing plants. That was a major issue, and it's an ongoing issue that is, you know, it's in the private sector, and yet obviously Ireland, high agricultural employment area, we process a lot of food for Ireland and Europe and the rest of the world, and there were a lot of outbreaks in food processing plants. And a lot of the workers there are new migrants to Ireland who potentially were living in vulnerable situations, either isolated or the other extreme, living in unfit conditions. And so that is something that really has come out to the fore in terms of a rural issue in Ireland. We also, because we have a proximity to international border with Northern Ireland, because there was different rules operating on either side of the border, caused major issues. And we've never really been able to enact any quarantining or checks on those borders, because obviously it's also tied to the Good Friday Agreement. Second homes or holiday homes has really, really been an issue. Maybe more so, I think, in the earlier stages of COVID-19. And you'll see some headlines there where there was a lot of issues, negativity, fear, and a feeling of vulnerability in rural communities that were particularly idyllic, where and there was a lot of insider-outsider feelings around rural Ireland at that time. So there's some of sort of the local issues that we had. From a national point of view, because we had a number, like a lot of other countries, social distancing, restrictions, there was a serious social impact and need identified. So, for example, here, various times over the lockdown and lockdowns, we couldn't move at one point any more than 2 kilometres from our home. Then it was 5 kilometres, and then it was to either 20 kilometres or to the next county. And that had knock-on effects for people being able to access services. And also while people were allowed to shop for food and for essentials, visiting others came into question, and there was a lot of implications for people being able to visit their elderly relatives, for example, or anybody living in isolation. As a result of the various restrictions, there was a nationally led response from the top down, which was called a community call. And that was really what was interesting. While that was nationally led, it was very much about harnessing bottom-up networks and existing social infrastructure. So some of those voluntary groups that I mentioned in earlier slides were kind of brought in under the umbrella of the community call, which gave a really strong remit to our National Department for Rural and Community Development. And it worked to reinforce the relationship between local government and community and voluntary sector. The remit of the community call was to do things like collection and delivery of essential items like food, Meals on Wheels, household items, etc., and to support people if they were experiencing social isolation or were medically vulnerable. And that is still in operation. Based on the information available to us from government, this is the most up-to-date information. Nationally, that movement, the Community Call Forum, you can see there, received over 65,000 calls. It did 13,000 collections and delivery. And you can see all the various follow-up. They identify social isolation calls, meal service calls, other health service calls. And so they can actually, it's in one sense, it was a really good opportunity to come together and actually collect data on community and voluntary sector in rural Ireland. I'm very conscious of the time here, so I'll hurry up. For many, and this is kind of going now towards the policy and the implications that we have for COVID, it has been an interesting time for the rural in Ireland, because we adopted a new rural policy, and remote working really is now being sold in many ways from the government level as one of the biggest sort of talking points and possibly a solution to some of the rural problems. But as you can see there from some of the headlines, there's some concerns about the equity of that. If people do flock to the countryside, what are the implications for rural areas? So in earlier this year, a new rural policy was developed for Ireland, our rural future. And really remote working and the revitalisation of rural towns has been to the core of that. And for many of the people developing that policy, the plan has been to really build on a lot of the positive local responses that have taken place and the existing networks to actually funnel them into creating a revitalised rural Ireland that has been sort of suffering, as you can see, a lot of population decreases and vulnerabilities in terms of economic diversification. So just summing up, really the OECD has identified that for rural areas and COVID, opportunities have been identified where possibly remote working can provide some solutions, although I think we have to be careful about how much of a solution that will provide. Greater awareness about accessibility to health, possibly being able to adopt to a more digital society. I'll let you read those in yourselves in your own time. The slides will be available. Finally, the crisis offers rural communities an opportunity to mobilise and strengthen their local networks and cooperative structures to face this economic shock. Rural areas tend to benefit from tight community networks, able to self-organise to adapt to structural changes. Local initiatives that emerge temporarily to address the immediate economic and social effects of the pandemic can be useful mechanisms to promote well-being and cohesion in rural communities in the long term. And in many ways, from an Irish perspective, the new policy for rural Ireland, our rural future, is attempting to adapt to that. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop sharing and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. I just wanted to have that as an initial opener. It's very, very broad, and hopefully we'll get the conversation going. It'll be really interesting to hear what everyone else has to say. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and it'll be reverting back to Ryan. So Professor Ryan Gibson is the Libero Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Guelph. Ryan is engaged with colleagues in research examining the impacts of COVID-19 on rural workforce development, immigration, and the voluntary and charitable sector. So Ryan, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Karen, for that introduction. This afternoon or this morning, depending where you are in the world, wanted to share some Canadian perspectives on COVID-19 responses. And there already is a number of parallels between what was presented by Karen and what's happening here in Ireland, or here in Canada, excuse me. So I'm joining you today from Guelph, Ontario, which sits on the treaty and traditional lands of the Mississauga of the Credit. And it's a delight to see everyone that's able to join us for today's discussion. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I want to share perspectives of the global pandemic on rural communities in Canada. And as you can imagine, there are no shortage of impacts, responses, and recovery initiatives, and it's far more than I could possibly capture in 10 to 15 minutes. I will share a series of highlights, however, with more details that will be available. You can follow any of those links that I've just posted. The other is that throughout the presentation, I've just included a small icon at the bottom of pages, which you can see here, where you might find more information and more resources if you are particularly interested in any one piece that I've shared. So as we look at the impact and the responses and the recovery, I thought I would start with maybe just giving a brief overview of rural Canada, particularly given our international audience that may be joining. So rural Canada is geographically very, very large, however, has a very small population. Across the country, rural and small towns represent about 18% of the national population, but contribute about 30% of the gross domestic product of the nation. And it's really important to recognize that rural communities are incredibly different and diverse across the country. And that makes planning for rural communities a bit of a challenge, particularly when we think of COVID-19 and the impacts, to recognize that there's not one single solution that may benefit all rural communities. So similar to what happened in rural Ireland, this chart presents kind of an overview of the COVID cases in Canada. And you can see that there have been kind of three peaks or waves of COVID cases across the country. In rural communities, we have also seen outbreaks that are quite unique, that are related to meat processing facilities, personal care homes, or among temporary foreign workers and migrant workers. And often these are instances where there is difficulty in social distancing within those environments. But you can see that there have been a number of different COVID cases across the country, and that we're now in a downward trajectory toward the right-hand side of that screen. And many of our provinces are starting to adopt reopening measures, lifting some of the restrictions that have been in place for the last number of months. The COVID pandemic was unexpected, and most communities were not ready for an event of this magnitude. That being said, rural communities in Canada have a long history of dealing with unexpected events. And I wanted to share some learnings that we have from rural Canada that's based on a report that was published by the Rural Canadian Revitalization Foundation with colleagues. And out of it were four key messages that I think are really important as we navigate the current pandemic. The first is that rural communities will experience the crisis differently. Back to the notion that there's not a single strategy to assist all rural communities, and that multiple approaches need to be adopted that build on local priorities, local assets, and capacities. The second is a really important recognition that industry or sectoral support does not always equal community benefits. And so as we start to devise our strategies for recovery, we need to be mindful of that understanding. As a colleague of mine, Sean Markey, has articulated quite nicely, sometimes our shovel-ready approaches dig us deeper holes at the end of the day. And so just because something might be easily moved into a response or an activity that can be done as a stimulus for the local economy doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do at the end of the day. And the other thing that we know from across Canada is that from previous downturns that local governments are going to struggle maintaining social and infrastructural services to their communities. We know there is an infrastructural deficit already before the pandemic, and the pandemic has just exacerbated many of those challenges that were there. So similar to what Karen referenced, there's been numerous impacts of COVID-19, and I've just listed a few here on the screen. There's been disruptions to employment opportunities. There's been disruptions to manufacturing, commodity chains as products are maybe not able to cross borders or have encountered challenges in that process. There have been challenges related to the delivery of health and social services in rural communities, particularly as we've moved things into an online format whereby broadband high-speed internet is not always available for all community members. We've seen disruptions to immigration patterns, the ability for communities to attract newcomers, as well as migrant workers that maybe are moving in and out of the country to support labor needs. We also have seen quite clearly that the global pandemic has exposed previously existing precariousness within rural communities that has long existed but has been highlighted by the current pandemic, such as broadband, the vulnerability of workers with regards to issues related to temporary migrants. Many of these issues have have a spotlight placed on them due to the pandemic. And the other is that the impacts of the pandemic have been unequally distributed across the country and across communities. So I want to take a moment just to look at some of the impacts in some employment statistics. These come out of Statistics Canada, and this is for 2020. You can see here the trend, toward January and February, employment quite stable. And then in March and April, we see a dramatic drop in the employment numbers. We do, though, however, as a positive, see a rebound starting in kind of May and June. And toward the end of 2012, we do see the numbers getting closer to where they were pre-pandemic. There is a wonderful dashboard that you can look at Stats Canada at the website listed there, as well as in the chat box, and you can start to dissect this data in more detail if it's of interest. Pulling on some of the work from Ray Bowman and the Rural Ontario Institute, here you can see the sectors, employment sectors across rural and small town Canada have experienced the largest percentage gap in the number of employed between 2021 and the previous years before the pandemic. You can see here in the red box, these are the sectors that were the most impacted by the COVID pandemic. You can see recreation services, culture and information being the highest, as well as accommodation and food, which is perhaps not surprising given the travel restrictions that were imposed. On the bottom half of this table, you see a number of sectors that were maybe less impacted by COVID-19, and these largely correspond to core services that were maintained throughout the pandemic, whether it's related to healthcare services, education, local government administration, or they also include industries that maybe were much easier to transition to a remote working possibility. And I think that's a really interesting thing to focus on for a few seconds, is the ability of rural businesses to transition into remote working. This table that's presented here is from Statistics Canada and outlines the differences between rural industries and urban industries and their ability to transition to an online environment. And the very first line at the top of this graph illustrates that almost twice as many urban businesses were able to transition to working remotely compared to rural industries. And there are a few reasons that would probably justify this, particularly the type of employment that's being done. You can imagine my family members were reminding me that it's very difficult to tend to livestock remotely. And so there are certain types of jobs that maybe we're less likely to be able to transition. The other factor that's been impacting many rural businesses and their ability to move to an online or remote learning delivery system is the access to broadband high-speed internet. Some really sage advice I wanted to share from a colleague, Sarah Breen, that is really important as we start to think about the impacts of rural of COVID-19 in rural communities, and that is that rural Canada is not a single unit. It's not a homogeneous experience, and we need to be mindful that trying to group it together actually might create a false impression that some communities are maybe doing well, while others are actually struggling. And so we need to be mindful that not all rural communities are the same at the end of the day. In the last few, 5 or 6 minutes here that I have, I wanted to share some responses, some interesting things that have happened in the Canadian landscape around how communities and governments have responded to the pandemic. And in a similar fashion to what was presented in Ireland, I want to share 2 initiatives that were led by the federal government and a series of local government and nonprofit delivered responses. The first one is called the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund, or more appropriately and more commonly referred to as the FFF program. This was a national initiative that was a $2 billion fund to assist businesses and communities that may require additional support to cope with and to recover from the pandemic. You can see there are 2 primary purposes of the initiative, and this initiative was available for both rural and urban communities at the end of the day. For rural and northern communities, the program was actually delivered through and in partnership with the Community Futures Program of Canada. The Community Futures Program consists of 267 nonprofit organizations that are in almost all rural regions of the country. And through the RRR program, businesses were able to access a loan of up to 60,000 Canadian dollars to support their business through COVID-19 and the recovery. Businesses were able to do a number of different things and different strategies for how to use the fund. There's 2 important things that I think are really useful to note here. First is that the loan is interest-free for the first period of time. And if 75% of the loan is paid back by the business, the remaining upwards to 25% would be a forgivable loan. The other important aspect is that the loan fund, the money that the Community Futures Program is lending out through the RRR program, as that is repaid, that money actually remains with the Community Futures Program to support their loan capital fund for future loans to support businesses, support new businesses, as well as business expansion in rural communities. For colleagues that are maybe in the European context, the closest equivalent to the Community Futures Program would be the LEADER program that had been delivered across the European Union. When we look to the impact of this RRR program, it's very impressive. We have almost 9,500 applications that have been supported by almost $315 million. At the end of the day, this fund has maintained about 35,000 jobs in rural and northern and remote communities across Canada. It's also important to recognize the intersectionality of their program. 40% of the loans have been given to women-led businesses, sole proprietors, as you can see there, as well as a high participation of tourism-based industries. So this is one response that took place across Canada. A second national program was called the Emergency Community Support Fund. It was a smaller amount of funds of 350 million Canadian, and this was targeted for charities and nonprofit organizations to ensure that vulnerable populations that were impacted by COVID-19 were still able to access services and programs. Across the country, about 5,000 initiatives were supported through the Emergency Community Support Fund, including both urban and rural. As you can see here, these initiatives supported food security, food banks, day camps for young people, particularly those children of essential workers, innovative support programs for young mothers that maybe were not able to access in-person services, as well as the opportunity for organizations and nonprofit organizations to purchase technology to support the transition to remote programming for isolated individuals. The 2 websites that I provided in the chat box, one will actually allow you, through the Community Foundations of Canada, to look at all of the individually funded initiatives across the country and the diversity of the different activities that are taking place. At the local level, here are a series of interesting responses that have taken place. Many rural communities are creating multi-stakeholder recovery task forces or strategic planning initiatives to try to figure out how to support local actors as they emerge from the pandemic, as well as to survive the pandemic. And this is looking very different in all communities. Some of these plans are around kind of building back better. Some of them are around retaining support and services that are currently there. But at the end of the day, the discussions are taking place and they're very much a multi-stakeholder approach. We have a number of communities that have created e-business programs that have supported organizations as well as businesses to migrate their services to an online platform. This might be creating websites, this might be setting on online payments, but at the end of the day, supporting those local organizations and businesses to move into the online world. We've seen an increased emphasis on local, particularly as it relates to retailers and producers. Many communities have created a series of buy local initiatives through their chambers of commerce, as well as the opportunity to market and to package locally produced goods in a box that can be purchased by local and regional residents. We've also seen that charities have been spending their endowments much larger than they have in previous years to support priorities in their communities, recognizing that there is additional services that are needed and that they are uniquely positioned to respond to them. We have a whole suite of voluntary activities that community members have jumped into the opportunity to support vulnerable populations. And this varies across the country, whether it's food banks, whether it's supporting individuals who may be isolated and have limited mobility. The other piece that I'd maybe share at this stage is we've also seen some amenity-based resident attraction initiatives that have emerged, whereby communities are actively trying to encourage new residents to move into their area around the quality of life, the access to green space, and this is particularly for those communities that are maybe metro adjacent to urban areas. And finally, I'd just like to end with maybe some big questions that we have to think about in rural Canada as we move forward with the recovery. The first one here, very much channeling my Jan Brady here, this broadband. This has been a huge concern for many communities as we've moved into this online remote environment. And for those communities that have no access to broadband or limited access to broadband, there has been a whole series of questions that have emerged around how do we resolve this long-standing dilemma. We also have an opportunity that communities and governments are exploring around how do we empower place-based approaches to recovery? How do we build on local and regional assets that are identified by local people? And how do governments support communities in both identifying as well as implementing these approaches? We have many questions around the future of work and what does that look like in terms of the remote learning, what happens, or remote working and remote learning, what happens after the pandemic, will those continue, and how will this impact rural communities? We also have a number of big questions around what I often call the VIPs, around vulnerability, around inclusion, and around precariousness. And communities have been introduced or reintroduced to these three concepts throughout the pandemic. They're not new, they did not emerge during the pandemic, but the pandemic has put that spotlight on vulnerability, inclusion, and precariousness in ways that communities are now having meaningful conversation and trying to figure out strategies. We've also discovered a huge need for more data so that we can ensure that we're making evidence-based decision-making. And the last big question that I would end with here is, where do rural communities access both the financial and the human capital required for a continued positive recovery, knowing that that human and financial capital has been greatly depleted over the last 15 months in surviving the pandemic. And so as we move to recovery, we need to be mindful that the capital might be a bit lower than anticipated, and for some communities, much lower than anticipated. I'm delighted to introduce our next presenter. And our next presenter is Mari Voyen-Meyer. And Mari is a research fellow with Norregio, with expertise in innovation, the bioeconomy, and governance. In addition to working on various topics connected to regional development, Mari has been recently focusing on issues related to COVID-19 and Nordic border regions. She holds a MA in International Relations and an MSc in Management of Bioeconomy, Innovation, and Governance from the University of Edinburgh. Mari, I'll turn the floor over to yourself.
I'm going to present a report today that I wrote with my colleague Alberto Giacometti, and we're kind of zooming in here on the types of on the situation in cross-border areas in the Nordic countries. And you can see from the picture here that we have both Sweden and Norway on either side. That's how you spell it in Norwegian and Swedish. And then you also have a photo here from Haparanda-Tornio, which is a cross-border area and city in the north of Finland and Sweden. So just to give you a little bit, just to give you some background here as well. This study was commissioned by two cross-border committees called Botnianak and the Svinesund Committee. And these cross-border committees are basically comprised of different municipalities and regions in the areas where they're located, and they work as kind of paradiplomatic organization. They were part of this group that we call the Thematic Group for Innovative and Resilient Regions, which is under the Nordic Council of Ministers between 2017 and 2020. And I also want to say that this study was very, very much empirical. It's all based on interviews because not much work had been done on this area when my colleague and I started. So we had in-depth interviews with about 36 informants from across these two areas, as well as international experts and international border associations as well, such as the Association of European Border Regions. And to kind of back this up and back up our findings, we were relying on a survey done by the Freedom of Movement Secretariat under the Nordic Council of Ministers, which had about 1,600 respondents in June 2020, which kind of says something about the importance for these for the border dwellers to get their message out there and being heard and whatnot. We also did a webinar with about 80 participants who were interested in this sort of topic and theme. And just to kind of check with our preliminary studies and our preliminary results, whether this is whether they could recognize it, because we didn't want to get it wrong, basically. And it was really informative, and we also had a workshop to work on some of the policy recommendations. We also did a cross-case analysis then at the end to look at the social, political and economic side of the findings and our informants information. There we go. Some of the key questions that we posed here are basically, what have been the immediate effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on border communities in terms of the social, the economic and the political aspects? What are the key challenges and opportunities emerging from the crisis, and what can be learned from the situation? So just to keep in mind as well that this was something that we did when the pandemic was ongoing, and obviously it's not over yet, and it's something that is continuously developing. So we were looking at this from March 2020 till November 2020. So it's not completely, it's an ongoing thing and it's constantly evolving. So it's a bit difficult to kind of pin it down as such, but I'll share some of the findings that we had with you. And just to show you where we are as well, because I'm not sure if you guys are all familiar with where Svinesund and the Botnianak actually is. So if you see here, you have Svinesund, which is covering these two regions, Västra Götaland in Sweden and Viken in Norway. And this area comprises of about 2.9 million people, which is nearly like half the population of Norway where I'm from. So we were looking at this very small area here around the border at the bottom of Svinesund, but then also in the Botnianak and around the border up here, which is where there is this twin city called Haparanda-Tornio. And in this area, we have three counties. We have the northern Osterbothnia, we have Lapland, and we've got Norrbotten. And this area is home to about 850,000 people, give or take. And what Nordic border regions really are is it's a home to a lot of different people. And some of the main things that are happening here is that, there's a lot of commuters going across the border all along the longest border in all of Europe between Norway and Sweden. There's a lot of trade and economy going on. There are shared public services, especially in the city of Haparanda-Tornio, which is essentially one city. And you have education, which is going across, you go to school in one country and you also work in one country and live in the other. So we have families and we have lives basically lived in these areas, across the borders. And the people living in these areas don't see the border. They are completely blind to it. And it's only when you move a little bit further away from the border, I think, that you can actually recognize it and see it. It's got so much to do with the identity that we have. And just to situate it within the world as well, and this is the kind of areas where Nordregio places its studies as well. You have the Nordic region here, and this is where we've been looking, and then you have the Baltic Sea region in green here, and you've got Europe, and you've got the Arctic, where we also have Canada, obviously. So just to give you some of the key findings from the cross-border communities in these areas. And obviously for everybody who have been, everyone has been affected by the pandemic, and they have been grave, both socially and economically. People have lost their jobs, people have been separated from their families when people live abroad. But in border communities is also this sudden resurrection of the hard border, which hasn't been around since before the passport union that was introduced in 1954. So for people living in the cross-border communities, where people are used to living borderlessly and working in one country and living in the other and having their families on either side of the border, it hasn't been just a health crisis, and the situation has been exacerbated in comparison to also people living within the country. So people have shared custodies of children. They haven't been able to go to funerals, for example. Minors attending school have not been able to travel across to see their parents because of the quarantine rules and whatnot. And this is kind of also all put in place because of the different types of strategies that have been adopted across the Nordic countries. One example of access to services is this one person who told us that he had to travel from one part of, like in Haparanda to Luleå, which is about 130 kilometers, to take a picture when he normally would just be able to walk across the town square. You also see quite a lot of negative publicity in the media on either side of the border, and there's this sense of these national cheerleaders popping up everywhere. We'll be having a bit of competition between the different countries in terms of who's doing better and who's doing worse, etc. And this is also then also seen in the social media and in the commentary sections and whatnot. And this is also then turned to physical aggression in terms of having vandalized cars, for example, where Swedish license plates, cars with Swedish license plates have been vandalized on the Finnish side of the border, for example. And the thing is, these areas have been actively encouraged to build up these type of mutual dependencies over time. This is something that has been encouraged politically, and when suddenly these kind of hard borders are resurrected, then how do you deal with that in the future? We also see that both these areas tend to be built on quite narrow economic basis. So for example, in Lapland, you're very much dependent on tourists, and on the Swedish side of the Norwegian border, you're very much dependent on trade. I think there was a loss of about 30 billion Swedish crowns on the Swedish side of the border because of the loss of Norwegian border shoppers, for example. So it's something, there are some really big social and economic repercussions of this. Obviously, this is also tied then to workplaces and people living and being able to live full lives. And what we see is that the nature of the dynamics of the border communities are quite poorly understood really at the national level, and they're also not really heard. There have been several pleas for help really from these areas, and the border communities have also stood together in trying to get people to change but their policies towards each other and having more place-based type of approaches, but this has not happened, unfortunately. And we talk about then Nordic cooperation. And what is Nordic cooperation? It's basically meant to be this idea that the Nordics are stronger by working together. It's built on the idea that knowledge sharing would lead to social innovation and change, and that Nordic cooperation really, we play each other good. The vision of the Nordic cooperation is also to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. However, this has been this has really been put to the test during COVID because of the different strategies that you see, with Sweden in the middle taking a completely radically different approach to Norway, Finland, and Denmark surrounding it. So but because we've been working together for the past 70 70 years or so, 50 years in Nordic Council of Ministers, you'd think we'd be ready to handle the crisis. But unfortunately, this has been disproven. Because what you see is that you have a bunch of inward-looking measures. And this is kind of, you focus on the people that are living within the borders rather than looking at people living across the borders. And this is one of the issues that needs to be addressed also going forward, because most likely this will not be one of the last crises that we're going through. And quite often, as I was saying about the municipalities and the cross-border communities and cross-border committees, you have these kind of soft multi-level governance structures where you work together across the different levels of governance. Those kind of soft multi-level governance structures across the borders have usually been a way to kind of overcome and address these kind of one-size-fits-all policies that have been mentioned by others here today, and kind of fit into the local context. But they always come secondary in these kind of sort of crisis situations. And the thing is, in these areas, there is no room for problems that originate outside the country, this kind of thinking, whereas the us versus them, when we're meant to be so integrated and been working for so many years to be integrated as well. So there's been a lack of coordination between the Nordic countries, which has exacerbated the situation in the cross-border areas, as I've been trying to tell you today. And the interesting thing is that there are so many platforms, there's so many forums for the Nordics to work together, but they've not been using these type of platforms for their own good and actually trying to use them as a crisis platform either. So the question is, there is a bigger question here as well, where we really want to ask, what should be the role of Nordic institutions when it comes to these type of big global questions? And as I said, the Nordic vision, the most integrated region in the world, but what happens when we are faced with also negative things and not just the positive? But the good thing is that when we know where our vulnerabilities are, we can actually find policies to build back better, as also have been mentioned here, and find ways to strengthen these type of institutions if we're willing to do it. One thing that we focused on in our report was the concept of resilience, and resilience, if you don't know it, is based on this Latin root called resilire, which is to bounce back or bound back. And when it comes to the pandemic, I think what is interesting to note is that we need to find new ways of cooperating, because obviously the old normal didn't work. So we need to find a new normal and then work towards building something that is stronger. So what we see is that in these communities, we really need to build, to restructure the way that they've been built and plan for the future in a completely different way. There needs to be some form of crisis management going forward as well. So one of the things that needs to be done, and also that was mentioned, I believe, by Karen earlier, is this kind of the less diversified economies that you find in these rural areas. And that's something that you need to think about and need to find ways of securing a more stable type of economy overall. And this has also got to do when it comes to building these types of public services, for example, and building the quality of life as well. Because it is interesting to note that, if, for example, in Haparanda-Tornio, which is one city, you don't necessarily need two public transport systems. You don't need two swimming pools, etc. You need to find ways of making it work, despite not necessarily having open borders. And this is kind of bringing me to the last question, which is something that we also need to work on in the Nordic region, I think, which is this thing about guaranteeing open borders over time, also in crisis situations. How do we do that? Can we guarantee it? Because it affects so many levels of so many things, both when it comes to housing and labour markets, when it comes to public services, and also then quality of life, but also this type of real Nordic integration and what we mean by that. So I think I will leave it there, because I think I might be over time, but thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
If you don't know me, I'm Karen Refsgaard. I'm also from Norwegia and also part of the ICRPS consortium. And I know there's one question in the chat at the moment, but you're welcome to either raise your hand or ask more questions. Before we start, I thought what's very interesting, I think that Karen started with and Mari ended with, is this about the new momentum, or do we having a new normal? We are all interested in rural development. We are interested in an improved rural-urban balance, and we've heard a lot about the challenges that you have faced both in Canada, Ireland, and also the border regions in the Nordics. I wonder a little bit about if you could also reflect a little bit on the opportunities. What we talk a lot about in the Nordics is, at the moment, for example, is the opportunities that digitalization will give us or can give us. We're talking a lot about the green transition, seeing a lot of the new bio and circular economy in rural areas. And we're also talking about multi-locality. So I was wondering a little bit if that's something that you would like to reflect on. And I'm also, and then while you think about your questions, we could have a little round on that. Ryan, you did maybe touch not so much on you talked about the rural recovery and the future rural work. And I was a bit curious about where do you see Canada when it comes to the new rural life? What will it change? And is green transition also part, and multi-locality also part of that in Canada?
Yeah, it's a great question. So before maybe jumping into the future of work, I would maybe just comment around your previous question. And I think one of the things that has emerged here is an opportunity for various stakeholders and actors to get together that were often doing really good things, but may not have been doing them in collaboration or even being aware of other folks that were doing good things. And so we're seeing the business community in a more robust conversation with health and with social services and in transportation. And this is building a much more holistic conversation around the future of rural places that maybe wasn't always taking place before. But when it comes to the future of work, I think in Canada, and it'll be interesting to hear other people's perspective that are on this call, I think there's multiple futures of rural work. And it depends on where you are, going back to Karen's notion of scale. It depends on access to technology. And it depends also on, I think, culture in terms of how this might operate. So for those communities that are within commuting distance to larger urban centers, I think we're going to see a really interesting time where people who have maybe migrated out of the city and have been working remotely will need to make decisions around, do they return to their in-place employment? Do they wish to continue in that remote sense? Do their employers allow them that flexibility even to start with? For those that don't have broadband or high reliable access to the internet, I think you'll start to see more conversations around ensuring that that essential service is available to them so that they can start to build opportunities for remote working, whether it be complete or a partial on that front. So I think there's going to be multiple futures of rural work in Canada with lots of conversations still to unfold, and it'll be interesting to see how those unfold across the country.
Good, thank you. Do you also want to respond to that, Karen and Mari?
Yeah, I can jump in first. That's okay, Mari. Yeah, I agree. I thought it was really interesting that I think while we had a common remit for the presentations, we didn't overly confer on our content, but yet I think there were really strong common themes throughout that struck me. And sort of there's two things emerging. There's possibly tensions that came to the fore, particularly Mari, think about you, and you talked obviously a lot about the border, and that obviously has major implications for Ireland. And I kind of touched on it slightly, where we, tensions around rules being different and people living, again, our border in Ireland is largely rural, and again, people don't see the border, you know, and thankfully, I think particularly in our case, given that, you know, we're only in peaceful times for a short number of years in reality as well, and obviously that, and then couple that with Brexit, we've had lots of fun in Ireland in the last couple of years in terms of the implications there, and really the border becoming something more than it was and different to probably what it was. And that still has to resolve itself, because we have Brexit to deal with as well as, and I know everyone does, but I think Ireland is particularly implicated in that experience. Relatively, you know, you mentioned green transition, and that's something that really come to the fore here in Ireland, where I think we're one of the first countries to actually have a regional just transition approach, which in the Midlands of Ireland is based around our peatlands, and which were industrially harvested decades by a semi-state body called Bord na Móna. And now that is being wound down, the bogs are being re-wetted and other various things happening with them. But definitely what I think I have found interesting in speaking and working with communities is that just transition also tying in with people using the countryside differently. And so in one sense, the movement towards using land differently, and in this case, if my example of the peatlands, I think in one sense it became real for people because they also are now sites for recreation, and not for international tourists and not even national, but locally for domestic, local amenity and recreational use. And that's been really interesting in terms of seeing people use the countryside differently. And I really am, when I go to scale, talk about the local level there, where I know probably a running joke that all we were doing was going for walks at times during lockdown when there was nothing else to do. But actually it has a very real implication for rural areas in that we're using spaces differently. And that does give rise for maybe avenues of regeneration and revitalization that we didn't really see as possibilities before. So that's been quite interesting. But tying that in with the green transition, I think at the local level has made the transition and climate change adaptation more real for people, I think, in ways.
Thank you, Karen. I don't know if Marty will respond to this as well, or you want to start to discuss why the Nordics have reacted differently. I think I can start. Marty and me work we have 5 Nordic countries and 3 self-governing territories. They have all had their own approach to the pandemic. And different rules and regulations, and working at Nordregio, where we are 19 or 20 different nationalities, have been quite interesting when we lived in Sweden or we worked in Sweden, where the approach was so different from the other countries. I don't know if this is the place to discuss that so much. I think we have actually a colleague who wrote a quite good paper on it, whether it's about that you individualize the responsibility in Sweden while you didn't do that in the other Nordic countries. And I think he's quite right about that. And we're happy to share that. If I must say, just come with a small comment to what you raised, I think, Ryan, was a little bit about lack or decrease of the cohesion and trust because you had a top-down approach in Canada. We also had a strict top-down approaches in some of the Nordic countries, but myself living in Denmark, we actually had a very large development of the local trust and cohesion. We sang at the national broadcasting. We had a lot of joint things going on between people. So all these informalities that Marty talks about, they came to matter so much. And because we trust the institutions, I think we just accepted the rules and regulations, and then we made the best out of that, at least. But maybe you want to comment some as well, Marty. on the
Yeah,
Sweden
sure.
versus the others.
Sure. I was just going to say as well, just to comment on the first thing that you brought up, Karen, about the opportunities. And I think something here which is really interesting is the opportunities that are coming with the changing on the labour markets when it comes to the structural changes that we need to see as well. There's been a lot of focus on skilling and reskilling the population in these areas around the border to make sure that they are actually able to transfer their skills, because they often have lower skill sets or lower levels of education than other places. And this is obviously then also enabling the kind of digitization, or is enabled by digitization as well. So you might see new opportunities. Another thing that was really positive that we saw on the Swedish side, and also I suppose on the Norwegian side, is that people have been focusing on buying locally. And this is something that has come from the municipalities as well, very, very much focusing on the local context. So new cafes and restaurants have actually opened up on the Swedish side, which is really, really nice to see. And you know, you understand the kind of the background for, you know, what you see is what you like, what you want to invest in. I think that's really important for rural areas, so that e-commerce won't take over everything. When it comes to Sweden's response, and I think our colleague is completely right about the kind of individual responsibilities in Sweden, but there's also a big difference between like how the different Nordic countries are actually governed. So we have different governance systems, and in Sweden it's very much on the agency side when it comes to these type of decisions, where it's government oriented in, for example, Denmark and Norway. So that's something that is different. There's also in both Denmark and Norway and in Finland, you also have these emergency laws or contingency plans, which you don't really have as much of in Sweden. Not that has been updated apparently since the 1970s. So this is one of the things as well. Like you had the opportunity to give the government extra mandates during this period in order to make these kind of quick decisions to move forward. Whereas in Sweden, this was also put to the agency. So there's a difference there as well in how things have been structured. But it's definitely got to do with trust in the individual responsibilities as well.
Good, thank you. We have some questions. Ray, I think that the people who are raising them should raise them themselves. Ray Borman, you're first. We can't hear you.
I'm unmuted, I think.
No,
so
we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, I was noting in the chat box there, a question box, there used to be a discussion of the death of distance, and I didn't live to hear the end of that discussion. But I'm wondering, are we into another discussion on the death of distance? How much work can actually be done remotely, and will rural places benefit from it? I'm just quoting a colleague here I used to work with at Statistics Canada. I recently published a piece that said most people that are teleworking want to go back to the office for at least a few days every week, which means they got to live mighty close to the city, it seems to me. Anyway, I was just inviting a new conversation on the death of distance.
Yes, any comments from the panel? Marty?
Yeah, sure. One of the things this is something that's really been brought up by some of the informants that we've had, and this is kind of like you see a new divide between the different types of workers. So you have the home working crowd, and then you have the people who can't go to work, and this is something that is, you know, like it's a completely new way of looking at it. And people that are also able to work from home tend to also have, for example, higher salaries or are less vulnerable in society in general, which is quite interesting, I think. I don't know if this is something that you've seen in Canada and Ireland at all.
Ryan,
Yeah.
you're nodding. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the death of distance, and I'm thinking of Friedman's book, The Death of Distance as well, I think pertains to perhaps some occupations in some sectors, but not all. And I think that's really important to have that nuance in the discussion, that there are some positions that may not be ever possible. And as Maria was mentioning, there is a definite discrepancy around those positions that maybe have the opportunity to have a work from home component to their job that doesn't apply to all employment opportunities. And I think in Canada, we've seen this particularly in the agricultural fields, as well as in some of the migrant labor industries that are employing large numbers of migrant labor, where that is not the case. So I think the death of distance is not happening in all of our employment sectors, but for some, it may very much be a reality. For those positions that can commute 2 or 3 days and work from home for those other days.
Thank you. We'll turn, Karen, you can have an opportunity for this as well, but there's a specific question to you from Ian Covey. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Do you want to raise a question yourself? Ian Covey.
Sure.
Oh, you muted yourself again.
Sorry, thank you. One aspect of your presentation that I thought was most striking was the restrictions of being limited to 2 to 5 kilometers radius from your own home. I think one advantage of rural areas is the open space and access to recreation green spaces in these regions. And in a lot of places around the world, these have served as like critical infrastructure during the pandemic in many places to address challenges related to mental health and well-being. So I was just wondering, was there strong pushback against these restrictions, and have these had a significant impact on the levels of well-being in Ireland?
It's perfect timing because my 3-year-old is knocking on the door, so you're going to hear it. He's been quiet for the last hour. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I was just thinking about it when I saw it in the Q&A. The pushback, there wasn't a lot of pushback in the first lockdown because I think there was a lot of fear and we're in this together was a very strong theme. The pushback came to those restrictions in the second and third lockdown. We had 2 more. We had another lockdown kind of October, November, and then we've been pretty much locked down since January and we're reopening now. The pushback came, so it's interesting because in urban areas there was pushback because although they would have all their facilities nearby, they had lack of that critical green infrastructure. So there was a strong pushback on the urban setting. Rural context, the pushback came because of the distance we have to travel to for services. Possibly kind of linked to what I've said already, I think people began to interact with their locality much more differently, and I think started to appreciate that critical infrastructure on our doorsteps. So in one sense, the limiting the radius was helpful in that sense, that we're using our local infrastructure better, but there was a lot of pushback, more because of the familial links we have in Ireland. I mean, family, and Mary mentioned this as well about funerals, you know, for example. It's a very big part of Irish culture. Big funerals are very normal. They're not just for famous people. And because we couldn't interact in the same way that we would have in the past, that's where the pushback came. I think more so sort of the services such as certain shops that were only located in cities, but also lack of contact with family and other community members was probably where the pushback came.
Thank you. Then Mikael Akimovic, do you have a question? And it links quite nicely to the first one that Kathleen Keaveney had, but she left, so I didn't take up that question. That was on quality of life indicators. But Mikael, do you want to come up with your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much to the presenters. So it seems that one transversal theme in your presentations is the fact that relationships and collaborations will be a keystone of the future for a genuine post-pandemic future. And I was interested by how higher education could play a role. So I come from France, and in France there's a huge public policy that aims to create major global universities, and more or less 10 universities will be selected and receive half the funding of higher education to reach the top 100 universities, which means tens and tens universities are going to see their resources decrease, and especially small universities and community colleges that are located in less urban influenced areas. So I was wondering if in your research fields you've seen some collaboration between the communities and these colleges or small universities. To what extent researchers are, let's say, squaring actors' initiatives, what works, what can be improved, and which communication media seem to be effective.
So, are there any of you who want to respond? It's maybe Ryan?
Maybe just a quick comment. I think the pandemic has really illuminated the need for collaboration, as was mentioned earlier. And I think not just within academic partners, but also in research organizations, charities, community organizations. And I think one of the big moments, aha moments that I remember having a conversation with a federal civil servant in Canada was that the government of Canada predominantly does not have any boots on the ground in rural communities. They don't have offices on main streets. They often don't have staff in their communities. And so when it comes to delivering programs and delivering responses at a federal level, and even less so on a subnational level, there's a need for that collaboration to take part. And I think universities and post-secondaries are absolutely part of that picture. And I think we've seen, and colleagues on the call can perhaps provide some illustrations as well, that communities are reaching out. Post-secondaries are reaching out to communities to try to figure out how we can kind of navigate this uncertainty together. And it's not to say that there's a clear-cut way to do it. I think every community has done this differently, but it also creates a disparity because not all rural communities or regions have access to post-secondary institutions. And there's not enough folks within post-secondary institutions to be actively engaged in all rural and northern communities. So it's a challenge, but I think there's been a real recognition of those groups that have their kind of their proverbial boots on the ground to become engaged and to find ways to support them in building their plans.
Thank you. We'll just take one more question, or we have two more we can reach. We have to end in 5 minutes, I think. Robert, you have a question about if the governments go. Present yourself. Question yourself. It's better.
Oh. Yeah, I was wondering from the examples that were given, were there cases, well, you give examples of coordination, whether top down or bottom up, but did you have cases where you had different levels of government actively working against each other? I'm not saying that that's the United States where the president was trying to work against the states or the states against each other or this big political divide, because we know that didn't happen. But were there cases like that in your examples as well?
Marty?
Yeah, sure. I don't think you would see that it's like actively working against each other, just because when COVID happened, at least in Norway and Finland, the power was very much centralized in the government, and thus you took away that kind of power from the local communities, which is, you know, in the Nordic countries, local municipalities have a lot of power normally, and this was completely or almost stripped back as such. So you wouldn't necessarily see a conflict because there wasn't really room for conflict. What you could see a conflict about was, for example, what was brought up about second homes and whatnot, and the allowance of people to allowing people to travel around, basically. And then you also have this, as I was saying in my presentation, these cross-border committees and whatnot trying to plead to the governments that they would open and have special cases or exceptions for the areas around there, but were completely just kind of, they were told that they couldn't make differences because there's been issues about creating new borders within the countries as well, which is not favorable to anyone, they were told.
I think I would just like to respond also a little bit from Denmark, a quite specific crisis. Denmark was a big mink producer, one of the largest in the world, exporting mink to China in particular. And when they found a virus in the mink production, the government decided to simply cut all mink production in Denmark, and all the farmers were, in the end, we don't have any mink production left. And there was quite a lot of different opposition to that, also from municipalities, because it differed which municipalities where they closed down, etc. So you could say in that case, as Mari also say, they have a lot of power. They couldn't do anything, but there was quite a lot of opposition to that from the municipalities, because it was also about the economic the sectors that matters in those municipalities, and there was a lot of indirect businesses related to the mink production.
One thing I'd quickly just add to Robert's question is, in the Canadian scenario,
please.
I think it was local governments that often competed against each other by virtue of government granting programs. And so there was more applicants than there were funding, which created a competitive atmosphere between neighboring communities and regions. And there wasn't necessarily maybe senior and local levels of government fighting each other, but local governments fighting each other just to get access to limited financial resources.
And Ryan, just carry on. I think we can reach one more question about the governance system in cross-border communities in Canada, US.
Maybe
Victoria,
a quick response to that.
But Victoria, you may ask the question. Sorry. Victoria, are you there? Yes.
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, good. Okay, thank you, Karen and Marie and everyone for your insightful presentations. This was really helpful. The question I have for Ryan was, I was quite intrigued about the community investment grants that were being administered in Canada, and I was wondering whether they found whether it was very effective in the cross-border communities, because Canada and US, just like Norway and Sweden, have very different government systems.
Yeah, it's a great question, Victoria. I think the short, brief answer is the pandemic funding and support programs to support vulnerable populations, business recovery, have been very difficult in border region communities, and much like Mari was mentioning, one of the biggest challenges is often one side of the border, and so these are communities that view themselves as a region with the border running between it, is that the funding, if they're successful, can only be applied to part of the region, and it can't be used to benefit the other side of the border. And so that's created a disparity around how to plan for a functional region that has a political boundary in it, but also created all sorts of challenges around how to support the larger community. Very much the similar themes that Mari was mentioning.
And we have one more question left. I'm sorry, I don't dare even to pronounce the name. Ovegoya. you have a question about Mari's empirical background. Please let us know how you pronounce your name.
Yes, it's Ovigwe Roy, but you could call me Lydia. My middle name is Lydia. So thank you very much, Mari. It was a good presentation, but I was just wondering if you had any empirical analysis, because you said you did a survey from March to November 2020. And I'm also thinking, since the narrative relating to the pandemic is changing, you have vaccine and all of that, is it the same thing that you see at the border? Thank you.
So just to clarify, we did not do a survey for this study. We actually did interviews with these 36 people. But what we did was we were kind of using the Freedom of Movement Secretariat's survey, which was conducted in July 2020. And I think they had another follow-up study in December, just to clarify on that. And I'm not sure if they are following up on that now, but we are actually working on a different project, which is looking again at this issue, but then also involving the Öresund region, which is between Sweden and Denmark. The Bron, you know, the bridge, which is also a TV series, that's the one connecting these two areas. So that's what we're doing now. And I saw there was if I can just be a bit cheeky, there was a question here about gender and the differences here. And we have seen some gender dynamics in these areas as well, because quite a lot of people work in the healthcare sector, from like traveling from Sweden and across the border to the Norwegian side. And these tend to be women. The municipality on the Norwegian side is also very much an industrial municipality where mostly men work. We are still a bit traditional here. So we do see that there is some form of gender dynamic in that sense, that there are people working in different sectors that have been kind of unfavorably positioned or put, basically.
Thank you. I know there are more questions. We don't have more time. It's very great to have so many different questions, huge variety, and also shared nicely between Canada, Ireland, and the Nordics. It would have been interesting to hear something from other places as well, but I'm sure that you could get the emails for Mari as well, and Karen and Ryan, you would have, if you are more interested in getting some feedback on your questions. And then I'll just hand over to Ryan, and you will wrap up and you'll take us to the next.
Yes, thank you so much, Karen, for that, and for everyone for joining us. There may have been a few questions in the chat box that maybe we didn't get answered. If there are, we'll take a read of those and pass them along to the speakers, and they can maybe respond via email to folks if there are some questions that were still outstanding. But wonderful to have all of this engagement. This brings us to the conclusion of the formal webinar, and I'd like to thank all of the presenters, but also everyone that was in attendance today for joining for this discussion. It's been incredibly interesting, lots of interesting dynamics taking place, and wonderful discussion.